Welcome to the Mind Money Spectrum podcast, where your hosts, Aaron Agti and Trishul Patel, go beyond traditional finance questions to help you explore how to use your money to achieve the freedom you want in life.
In this episode, Aaron and Trishul discuss stress and its role in the difference between happiness and well-being. There can be times where stress reduces happiness, but actually improves well-being and life satisfaction. They explore some of the ways money and work impact stress. In general, there's probably too much stress among the population, but too little stress can sap the motivation to overcome challenges. The sweet spot of stress can lead to accomplishments that provide fulfillment, self-worth, and value to your life. Listen to the end where Aaron and Trishul share some personal stories on what they do to reduce but not eliminate stress within their own happiness and well-being in mind. And now, on to our conversation.
Hi, my name is Aaron Agti. I'm a financial advisor in the Bay Area. I'm here with Trishul Patel, a wealth manager on the East Coast.
Hi, Aaron.
Good to see you. Today, we're going to be talking about the idea of stress and how it relates to work and well-being. Our last two episodes, we've been talking about different domains of well-being, and there's been a pretty strong correlation between happiness research and well-being. But today, we're going to be discussing kind of things that don't line up between those two areas, between kind of well-being and life satisfaction versus happiness. Because when it comes to stress, it tends to be pretty counter to most happiness research, that the things that cause stress tend to also reduce happiness, especially kind of on a day-to-day basis. So today we're going to be exploring a little bit of when can stress be good? Question mark. And when is it something that we should be kind of trying to avoid? So, Trishul, my first question to you is, what are your original thoughts about the idea of stress as it relates to well-being and or happiness?
Initially, what comes to my mind is that we as individuals tend to be overstressed as a society. That's what I think about. I understand that maybe a little stress is good, and we'll talk about that a bit later, but I get the strong feeling that on a whole, there's probably too much stress out there. And I think there's some good backing to this, throwing a few numbers out there from a 2017 survey from the American Psychological Association. Some of the most common things that people stress about are the future of our nation, number one. Number two, though, apropos to our business and our lives, is money. Number three, work. And that kind of ties into money as well. And then, of course, there's some politics and violence and things like that. I would note, probably 100, 200 years ago, violence was probably a lot more of an issue than it is today. We do live in a relatively peaceful time, even though it may not sound that way based upon what we hear around us in terms of the impressions we get from media and society. But it is still relatively a lot safer to be alive now than it has been in the long-term past. But I think the others are kind of here to stay, and they're worth thinking about in terms of money and work and things like that. So I think that's probably where my mind goes to. We seem to be overstressed.
I would agree with that. And I think the first thing that you mentioned is some of those we can kind of control by our choices, and others we may not get to. So I was actually a little surprised that the future of our nation was the number one stressor. Although I'm surprised, like just reading any news or anything online, that should not be surprising at all. But I mean, it's surprising that there will be days where I'll be on a vacation or just out and about working on something, and I don't check the news or social media for a day, and I just forget about it. It just doesn't come to mind. And you can kind of choose to ignore it because the future of our nation really doesn't affect you on a day-to-day basis. It comes up in conversation, and there are kind of some bigger ongoing themes that come up and you want to be aware of, but it doesn't affect you on a day-to-day basis if you just don't turn on the news or you don't go on Twitter.
Maybe that's a good point. So do you regularly watch the news on TV?
I don't watch the news on TV, but I will go to news websites, but not with any regularity. I tend to be more on Twitter, following different writers and journalists that I think have an interesting view. I also try to make sure to follow a few on both the left and right, but though they end up being more of a financial bent anyways, just because of our industry, our profession, and my personality. But there are days where I just won't participate in the news. Like I know the impeachment hearings are going on this morning, and I know other people are talking about it, but it's just going to take up time in my day, and I'm not going to enjoy it. I will wait to read a recap after the fact from news sources that I trust. But my point is, I can choose to ignore the things related to the future of our nation because it doesn't affect me what I need to get done today. But the money and the work, those do seem to really make sense because they're kind of omnipresent and they do affect you at the individual level, where you really do need to be thinking about these things and focusing on them on a day-to-day basis to get to where you want to go. And these are also things that you can control. The future of the nation, you can vote and participate, but it's such a large macro scale that any individual choices don't make that big of a difference. But for money and work, your individual choices do make a difference. So I was a little surprised to see that the future of the nation was a higher stressor. And maybe that's just the time we're in right now. Maybe it's something more recent. The money and work, those feel like they've been kind of normal stressors for a long time, regardless of current political environment.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I think it may be a ramification of the times we live in. And you're right, you may be an outlier from the perspective that you're not tuned into, watching daytime or evening news every day and on the pulse of that type of information that perhaps leads to more stress and not necessarily more information. Maybe, that type of channel is more designed to kind of gear at your emotions and pull you into entertainment by suffering or causing stress, maybe. But I think what you're saying does make sense to me. That makes a lot of sense. It's kind of like that notion of what was that few lines about wisdom? Wisdom is knowing that which you can control and that which you can't, and focusing on the former rather than the latter.
The Serenity Prayer. It's
I butchered that, didn't I?
The courage to change the things I can. Maybe the patience to accept the things I can't. That's not patience, but I'll get that right. And the wisdom to know the difference.
Right. There you go.
The wisdom is the knowing the difference between what you can change and what you can't.
Right. So from what you just related, worrying about national politics or the future of our nation might be something that, yes, we can control it from the standpoint of voting and being active, but maybe being tuned in is a little bit too much given the amount of control we have. But certainly for money and work, there's some wisdom and understanding that we do have more control there.
Yeah. So when it comes to money and work, I don't know if it's either your personal experience or you work with clients or what you've read from research. What are kind of some of the stressors there?
Well, when it comes to money, I think there's the short term, which is, I think often what I've noticed is when people look at their paycheck or they think about their annual salary, they kind of look at the top line and they spend to that, which
Mm.
basically leads to the notion that, okay, I make 100,000 a year, so I can easily spend 30, 40,000 on a home, spend another 10, 20 on car payments, no problem eating out for another 10, 20. And, that leaves 80 or 90,000, 10,000 and change left over, and I'm good to go. And at the end of the day, you end up saving maybe a few percent of your income, if that at all. And that can be stressful because we all realize that if you follow a methodology like that, it's likely that you're probably going to be living paycheck to paycheck, even though you're making a good amount of money. And you're probably going to be stressed out about your future as well along the way, because there's really not much room for error. There's not much room for issues coming up that inevitably will. So I think from the pure money perspective, a lot can be considered that maybe isn't when people just think about how they spend their money.
That's interesting. When I first thought of the idea of work and money as it relates to stress, I guess I wasn't thinking about in terms of spending versus savings and those taxes. I do see the same thing. It's kind of people kind of naturally spend enough that they have to pay for taxes and save with the same amount of money or like the same percentage of their income. And the IRS takes all of their taxes and they don't have anything left to save. Like I have seen that a few times, but I've also seen even at higher income levels or with dual income households where they actually are saving well enough. Maybe not as high as you'd like, or maybe with my help we try and bump it up a little bit, but they do prioritize saving. And so the stress is it's less about kind of having enough, and it's more of a combination of they're working enough to make these high incomes and save enough, but they either don't know what they should be doing with their money, they don't know how much they need to be saving, and or kind of they're working so hard that they don't know how to enjoy their lives. And it almost is that the unknown aspect. It's not that they're not having trouble living paycheck to paycheck. It's not that they're not saving enough. It's even if they max out their 401k, they don't know if that's enough. They don't know if they're on track, whatever that track should be. And they don't know if what they should be doing with their free time. And so there's this additional layer of they're working a lot, but they don't know kind of why they're working so hard. It's this really there's a missing explanation for them they don't have kind of their purpose in life kind of feeling where I know I'm doing lots of good things right now and I'm definitely moving forward, but there's this unknown feeling of I need to keep getting raises and promotions and keep kind of maintaining my lifestyle and keep increasing my savings and make more money and be more successful. And that ends up adding stress where it is also money and work related, but it seems almost as at the complete opposite end of the spectrum from what you're describing.
Right.
And I wonder if you've seen that as well, where it's not a day to day, am I saving enough basis? It's a I just don't know what to do with my life basis.
It sounds a bit existential from that perspective.
I guess it is. It is, but it's there. I have seen enough people that are making really good money, and they like their jobs well enough. have a good kind of work community. They like the people they work with. Their manager isn't bad by any means, but they still have this kind of unknown stress that they want to get out of, and they don't know why. And they can't identify what the source of the stress is, just that it seems to be work and money related.
It could be. I think what you're highlighting is something that I mentioned a couple episodes ago. The notion that the number one underlying human emotion beyond all other emotions is angst. No matter what we're feeling, there's always this feeling of uncertainty that kind of grinds at us, even if things are good. And as far as the distribution of individuals go along this stress money spectrum, I think probably for the median case, you may have heard this. The average American is, $500 away from disaster if something bad were to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, they don't have the savings or buffer to weather the storm if something bad happens. And I feel like that's probably a big cause of stress for the majority. But there certainly are people on that spectrum where they do have that buffer. They are saving correctly or enough or much better than average. And things are going well in terms of career and life, in terms of where they should be. But there's still this underlying concern of stress. And maybe what that ties into is the notion that what we really want to focus on is not only financial freedom, but this notion of life freedom and time freedom. Now that an individual has that level of financial freedom, what does it mean to have a better life or more time on one's hand? What does one do with all that? Does that kind of make sense from what you've seen and what you've tried to focus on?
Yeah, it really does. And I think that ends up being the best conversations I have with clients go beyond just what should I do with my money. It really is, what is the lifestyle that you actually want? And it's drilling down, because I have some people say, oh, I'd love to travel. They like traveling. They travel a little bit now. And they say, oh, if I retired, I'd spend all my time traveling. And after digging down deeper, I've helped some of them realize one particular case, she wants to open a bakery. Like that, this is her actual dream. She actually wants to open a bakery and wants to, like, she likes to travel, but she would rather spend her time baking. I had another client. She talked about how she liked the company she's working for and she liked the work she does, but she wanted to retire. She wanted to get out, and she wasn't quite sure why. Had to dig deeper, had to go through a kind of series of questions and conversations. And it turns out she just really hated the 9 to 5. She really hated having to be online during those times. She actually didn't mind the work, and she didn't mind she actually loved some of the projects she's working on, but it was that expectation of her time that she was starting to truly dread. And so what we're working on, kind of, how big of priorities are these, and do we want to actually move towards these goals? So I do think that it is those kind of intentional decisions about life that really do help, where they don't even change their jobs. They're still both in the same job, but by identifying the things that cause the stress, they feel more confident and comfortable that they're moving in the direction to eliminate that part of the stress. But going back to kind of our original opening subject, what are some of the ways that you've seen that stress can be good, especially around work? That as we've talked about kind of all the reasons stress are bad, and we've talked about other ways in the past episodes about how we can kind of mitigate that by different conscious life decisions. But you were sharing that stress might be good. And I was really curious about that.
Right. So anecdotally, I remember seeing this diagram in one of my doctor's offices maybe 10, 20 years ago. And it's a really simple chart. I think maybe the physician just drew it with a crayon and put it on the wall. But the notion was that on the x-axis, going from left to right, you have stress, so low stress to high stress. And on the y, going up and down, you have this notion of productivity. And what people generally think is that if stress is low, you're very productive. And as stress goes up, productivity goes down. But what this chart tried to say in crayon is that basically, if stress is low, you actually don't end up being very productive. And of course, when stress is high, you're not productive either. But there is this kind of sweet spot where stress is manageable, but also motivating, which leads to higher productivity. So it's kind of like an N curve, which starts low, gets to a high point, and then drops off as stress increases. And I've had that picture in my mind as I think about how I've lived my own life. And I think it does resonate true in many cases. For example, I remember as I was working through my career, there were many times where I would be doing a certain type of task or job or duty that I would have never imagined I would do if I had to motivate myself. But the fact that I was in a work environment, here I am doing something and actually doing it pretty well just because there's this outside pressure to perform. So I feel like that's kind of been helpful to me at times to kind of break out of my shell. One thing, for example, is I was an engineer by training, but I ended up doing a lot in business development, talking to people about some of the products that I've created or some of the investment solutions that I've designed up. And being able to convey that has allowed me to become better at understanding what people are going for and what's important to them, but also to help better frame what I have learned so that I can do better at my job. It's that notion that to really learn something, you should try teaching it or explaining it to somebody else, right? That's how you really start to pick things up. But my original personality was not to do that. It was to kind of read books and try examples and tinker in a back room. But opening up these options through my career, adding, more stress beyond what I would have been comfortable with, ended up being beneficial. So I can see how stress can be helpful from that perspective.
I can see that, and it actually lines up with some of the kind of evolutionary psychology research and evolutionary cognitive research that I've seen of the idea that there's a little bit of adrenaline actually helps you be productive. And if you can go through these phases of kind of amping up, your stress hormones go up, your adrenaline goes up, you really do get more productive, with the kind of additional medical advice that if you're always stressed, it becomes kind of a new baseline for you, and you need more of that stress hormone and adrenaline to get to that productive level. And so you need to actually be able to have times of relaxation where you can really turn off and eliminate that stress and adrenaline. But that does line up with kind of the classic scientific research that I've seen that, yeah, you need a little bit of that pressure, whether it's external or internal, but you need some way to kind of find that motivation and find that impetus to really kind of put your nose to the grindstone and get something done. And stress is certainly part of that. And I think I probably have seen that. Probably seen in my own life, just because I tend to procrastinate a little bit too much, that sometimes just the deadline spur action, and that's probably been my overarching impetus for getting some of the things done that I need to. And the way I've learned to kind of take advantage of that is I will set artificial deadlines for myself of I need to get this done in the next 2 days because I can see out the 5 days after that I have other things I need to get done. And so I create these artificial deadlines, and those actually do put a little pressure on me and kind of increase my stress level just a little bit, but that's how I personally get things done. And I guess I hadn't thought about it in terms of the idea of stress, that I'm intentionally adding stress. That's an interesting thought. I definitely want to think about that more of trying to find other examples in my own life where having added stress has been good rather than something just to avoid. And I think the last thing I was curious, what we'd even consider the idea of how would stress, especially related to work, fit in with the idea of well-being and fulfillment.
Yeah, one thing comes to my mind is there was a quote for Buffett, since I haven't quoted Jimmy Buffett today. The notion is you want to provide your descendants or your kids with enough money so that they can do anything they want, but not too much so that they'll do nothing.
For those listening who have not heard our past episodes, this is an inside joke. Trishal's actually quoting Warren Buffett. And I, a while ago, made him clarify that he's referring to the Oracle of Omaha and one of the greatest investors ever, not the singer Jimmy Buffett. But go on with the Buffett quote.
Right. Well, the notion there is if you have all of your problems solved, it's likely you will do nothing. Meaning, if you had all the money in the world to do whatever you want, maybe that's too much. Maybe that's too much freedom. Maybe that's too little pressure to perform. So as humans go, we want to give ourselves the opportunity to excel, but we don't want to likely have all our problems taken care of for ourselves. And I think that makes sense to me from that perspective of stress, where there's likely a sweet spot where if we want to excel and push things forward, a little bit of pressure is pretty good, or maybe slightly more than a little bit.
I like that. And I do think of a few other client situations I've seen where I've shown them that through their hard work, through their savings, and with an appropriate investment strategy, they are financially independent now. That if they wanted to retire, they could retire. They do not have to work. They don't have to earn any more money. They can support their lifestyle with their assets and income. And some of them don't retire. Some of them continue to work. And I would tell them they're financially independent, and then we'd sit down again a year later, and I'd say, you're still financially independent. You've actually saved more because you kept working. But it took, again, those deeper conversations to learn that they truly felt fulfilled through the work that they did. That they liked the people they worked with, they liked the project they worked on, and they derived kind of self-worth and value from these accomplishments, from taking on these challenges and overcoming them. And I do like that idea that it's the having the problems to face and going through them and growing and getting better does feel like one of those really fulfilling things in life, and it really is important to your overall well-being. And I can see that for some people it is their work, where the salary is definitely important early on, but later on the salary ends up becoming almost more like confirmation of the recognition that their work does have value. It's they don't, if they don't need the salary, they wouldn't do it for free, because they're not doing it for charity. There's not quite those positive feelings you get from pro bono work or from giving your time or money. It really is that they're showing they can make contributions to a company or organization, and those contributions are valued. And that's what I think is, when you first mentioned the idea that stress could be good, that's what came to mind, was that the idea that people truly do find fulfillment in work, and that's okay. And not everyone does. Not everyone has kind of the right job. Not everyone has the right people they work with. So some people truly want to be out of the rat race. They want to no longer have to go to the office, and they have other things that they do in their lives to find fulfillment. But for some people, even though work can be stressful, and even though the projects they take on require that additional effort, that requires that extra stress, they find value in that they find their self-worth, and that provides kind of the confidence and just general well-being in life. And one of the things I try to recommend to these clients is, even if they are financially independent and enjoying their work, that it's not too stressful, that they still have to find those other times that they can turn off, that they are not experiencing that stress. Because if there's too much stress, that actually leads to other health problems. I think we're going to discuss that in a future episode, but that finding that balance between when is stress good and when is it dangerous to your health. And I guess I hadn't thought about that sweet spot, and that does kind of make sense and fit some of the observations I've had with clients. And so I'm curious if you have any other kind of stories of how has stress been good for just general life well-being.
Well, I've heard examples of what you're talking about as well from clients on my end. The notion is sometimes you have an individual or a family or a household where they've had careers that have lasted decades, and they haven't really thought past what to do after retirement. It's a big question mark. What they've known is you wake up, you go to work, you have a high amount of fulfillment. Often you have a great career where you're looked up within your society and within your job as a professional. And it's what you know, it's what you're comfortable with. But what often that entails is this, as we mentioned earlier, a bit of an existential dilemma on, okay, but now what? What do you do now with your life? And I think that's where the questions of beyond just financial planning, of actual life planning come into play, where it's worth exploring with a client, okay, but what do you really want to do with your life? If you only had X amount of time to live, what would you regret not doing? What do you think you would do if you only had 5 or 10 years to live and you wanted to make the most of it? Would it really be going to that 9 to 5, or is there something else deeper that you think might be more fulfilling to your life?
I agree 100%. It is those questions of some people, they don't know what they would do if they didn't have work. And it's almost like that fear of the unknown, getting back to kind of that just fear of what they can't control, and they don't know what they're going to retire to, and they're not unhappy with what they would be retiring from. So they like their life now, and they don't know what they'd be doing if they didn't have work. They continue to stick around. And I think it's those questions, like you said, of what would you do if you had 5 to 10 years? And it sounded very George Kinder's 3 questions. I like that.
Right. Well, since you mentioned the name Kinder, you want to give a little background on what that's about?
So George Kinder, I guess he'd be considered kind of the father of life planning. He created the Kinder Institute, and he has 3 questions that help identify either an individual or couple's values independent of money. And when you go through these questions and you have someone who has kind of trained on what questions to ask, you are able to then explore, okay, if this is your ideal life that you know that you want, how do we use your money to get there? How do we make those intentional decisions to get to those questions? But I think I want to save the 3 questions for a future episode, because I think that's a much deeper conversation, because I do love those love those questions. But I like just the general idea of life planning, and so much of making good financial decisions is just having clarity on what you want out of your life. That sometimes it is being financially independent in your 30s, and that's a very admirable goal. Sometimes it's finding the job that you enjoy now, and sometimes it's spending more time with friends and family, and that's kind of why we talk about these different things, these different domains of well-being and how they relate to happiness, is just trying to help clients find those answers to those questions, so that when we say, okay, what do you want to do with your money, they're able to actually start to answer those questions.
Yeah, I certainly think that's a bigger topic that it would be great to get into down the road a bit. But you're right, it's important to understand that when it comes to handling what an individual should do with their money, it's really should be about what they should do with their life and what's important to them. And I think you're also right with the notion that that relates to stress, because part of it can be the notion that you're not really doing what you want if you're focusing on money but not focusing on your life. And part of it could be that if you are checking the boxes in terms of money, there could still be more out there for you as an individual that maybe is worth considering if you're able to, most certainly.
Yeah.
I think you also talked about the notion that stress, or we've also discussed that stress can be bad. So it's probably worth noting, what do you do in your life to de-stress, Aaron? How do you keep the stress meter under control?
So I was going to go into this future episode, kind of health, both mental health and physical health. But it's like things like sleep help a lot. I try to get outside. I love being outside. So trying to get my kids out the door on time in the morning is extremely stressful. And their school is 1 mile away. It takes me about 20 minutes to walk there. I've run to school sometimes to pick them up. It's about, I can do a mile in about 10 minutes, not try and run very fast. But if I try and get them out the door, they, with their shorter legs and just being kids, it's like a 27 to 28-minute walk. So I have to get them out the door like 15 minutes before they normally do if my wife drives them, and my wife drives to work. So the stress of trying to get them out the door on time is worth it to me for the payoff of walking them to school and walking back. That is one of those little things that I specifically work on because I love that walk outside. I like putting on podcasts on my headphones and just going for walks for a while. I try to play sports and be active, and probably because there's also a social component to that as well. So I play softball, I play golf. Last night I ended up playing, there's a small par 3 course that has 9 holes that's lit at night. So I played that for an hour last night. So I try and do different things outside. I find that when I'm outside, I'm less likely to be stressed.
That's a good one. There was actually a study that said people who spend at least 2 hours in nature a week are significantly more likely to report good health and psychological well-being. So I think that's a good one, Aaron.
So I think next time I'm going to ask you the same question, because I think next time we want to talk about going deeper on that physical and mental health and how that relates to well-being.
Great. Yeah, I think that dovetails into a pretty good conversation, Aaron.
Great. So thank you very much, Trishul. I really appreciate you providing some insight on how stress could be good.
Great conversation today, Aaron. And thank you, everybody, for listening. I appreciate you coming out and checking us out today. And we look forward to talking with you again.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of the Mind Money Spectrum podcast. Be sure to visit mindmoneyspectrum.com to access the entire library of episodes. Remember, it's not black and white, but the wide spectrum of gray area where you get to pursue the freedoms you want in life. Opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested in directly. Have a nice day.